Welcome everyone to this edition of Cape Ann ARTWaves, coming to you by way of 1623 Studios located in Gloucester, Massachusetts. This program is focused on what I hope are engaging conversations with area talented artists and makers. I'm Kristine Fisher, your host today. I share hosting duties with Jacqueline Ganem DeFalco. I love the fact that I'm always learning from every artist that I interview. And today I'm so excited to welcome an artist whose name and work will be familiar, but perhaps his backstory is not as well known. Steve Lush is an immense talent, and he brings such a rich background and unique perspective to his work. A few notes about Steve. He is a signature member of the American Watercolor Society, the Transparent Watercolor Society of America, the American Society of Marine Artists, and the New England Watercolor Society. Steve's work is in many private and corporate collections throughout the United States and Italy, to include the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, the Museum of America and the Sea, Mystic Seaport, Mystic, Connecticut, the Coast Guard Art Program, the Heritage Asset Collection at the Coast Guard Academy, New London, Connecticut, the Noble Maritime Museum, Staten Island, New York, and the Customs House Maritime Museum in Newburyport, Massachusetts. This should give us a good flavor into Steve's background. Steve is represented by the gallery at 4 India Street on Nantucket and the Charles Fine Arts Gallery here in Gloucester. Steve is also a leading member of the Experimental Group, which is part of the Rockport Art Association here in Rockport. He's also very active with the North Shore Art Association, also here in Gloucester. We're so lucky we have such an active arts community. And he is married to the wonderful painter Nella Lush, whom we had on the program just a few weeks ago. They both have a studio in the SoA district of Boston, as well as in North Andover, Massachusetts. Welcome, Steve.
Good morning, Kristine.
Oh, it's great to see you. Great to see you. I think we should just preface our conversation here with the fact that you have been showing your work since the 1990s and working full-time as an artist since 2005. So take us away, fill in some of the blanks for us.
Well, prior to 2005, I mean, I was doing art, but I wasn't really showing it. And I'm a professional engineer as well. So, I mean, I kind of balanced working as an engineer and an artist, which a lot of people said, how can you do both? And basically the way I approach engineering is solving problems, thinking outside the box more creatively. And the way I attack my art is very methodical and almost like an engineer would to solve problems. That's kind of the way I work, which is a little strange, but that's how
both sides of the brain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I mean, it started off when I was really young. I was surrounded by art and music in that both my mom and my grandmother, her mother, were very accomplished pianists and organists. My grandmother was a professional organist. And my mother was an accomplished artist. So there were always paintings on easels and tons of art books and magazines always around the house. So, I mean, apart from playing with kids and playing outside, when I came back inside, there was art.
Wow, you were so fortunate. What a fertile upbringing in that way.
Copies of the New Yorker magazine laying around, and I would always kind of gravitate to looking at Saul Steinberg cartoons, which I loved.
Right.
And I think as I got older, in junior high school, I had the ability to draw because my mom showed me how to draw. She showed me how to perspective and shading and tone and all that. And so a friend of mine and I, when we were, I think it was the 7th grade, we decided to make this newspaper, a handwritten newspaper, where we would include stuff that was going on with our friends or families and whatnot. And I would include in that sketches, cartoon sketches, I'd block them in.
I love it.
And so that was kind of my start in drawing and paint. Well, not really painting, but drawing. I spent a lot of time drawing with pencil and pen and ink. And then I guess the music thing kicked in probably when I was maybe 14. I got a guitar. The Beatles had just come on the scene. I started to play the guitar with a friend of mine. We started a rock band, and I was in and out of rock bands probably all the way through a year or so, even after I graduated. What happened, I graduated from high school. I was one of the youngest in my class when I graduated. And instead of going off to Berkeley, I got a job in a shipyard in East Boston.
Mm-hmm.
And that year I lived with my grandmother, who lived in Chelsea. So I was working in the shipyard as a laborer. And now the ships got into my blood because I really liked working on these things. It was really a lot of fun. And I was the youngest guy in the shipyard.
Mm-hmm.
And one day my father came home with some brochures from the Massachusetts Maritime Academy. And he said, take a look at these. And he said, do you think this may be an option as opposed to going off to Berkeley, which I hadn't applied to.
Mm-hmm.
I did apply for, I did have, I had started the ball rolling to go into the Air Force. This was like 1968, the year after I got out of high school. And then my father had this brochure about the Maritime Academy. He said, would you like to get down and just see what it's all about? So anyway, I ended up being accepted to the Maritime Academy. Got out of there, and I had a degree, a commission as a reserve officer, an ensign in the Naval Reserve, and a marine engineering degree.
Mm-hmm.
Now what was I going to do? So I was looking for some ships to go on. And what I found locally were some tugboats that I worked off and on, a couple of small coastal tankers. And then one of the guys that I played in rock bands with said, hey, why don't we go out to California? There's some friends of ours from Reading that are out there starting up a band.
Mm-hmm.
So we loaded up his old car with our guitars and amplifiers, and we went out to California. Ended up spending a year out there. Started off playing in some rock bands that were pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a lot of time in between where we weren't making any money. And I was the only one that could make any money. I was the only one that had some other options besides music. So I took a bus up to San Francisco. We were living in Ventura down in Southern California. I took a bus up to San Francisco, and I just walked into the Standard Oil Company of America, their shipping division on Market Street in San Francisco. And I just walked in, and I started talking to one of the guys there, and he said, you just graduated from the Maritime Academy? And I said, yes. And I have these, here's my credentials, and I'm living in Southern California. He said, well, you're in luck. If you want to get on one of our tankers, we have ships that went from San Francisco they hit all the ports in Alaska, Oregon, Seattle, up the coast of Alaska, then out to the Aleutian Island chain. Then they would go from there to the Hawaiian Islands, and we'd hit all of 5 or 6 islands in the Hawaiian chain. And then we go further southwest to Wake Island.
Oh, wow.
7 days further west. And then we'd come back to El Segundo in just south of Los Angeles, and then back to San Francisco. So it was a big triangle. So I did that for a year, the first year.
Mm-hmm.
Got back to Boston, and a friend of mine from the Academy mentioned that American Export Lines were looking for engineers. This was a freight company out of New York. So again, I went down to New York. I walked into their office on Battery Place in New York City. Managed to get sign onto a ship. A couple of days later, I had to report 2 days later to this ship, this C2 tanker, a freighter, that was en route to, of all places, the Mediterranean. I said, you gotta be kidding me. I can't believe this. So I'm going to the Mediterranean, and I ended up staying with the American Export Lines for 4 years. So 4 years with them, traveling to the Mediterranean several times, and a couple of India trips, which were 6 and 7 months each, because a couple of reasons. First of all, when we went to India, the Suez Canal was closed. We had to go around South Africa to get to India. So it took 2 weeks to get to Durban, South Africa. And by the time we got there, we were out of fuel. So we had to refuel And then we'd go from there up to Karachi, Pakistan. And then we go down the coast, the west coast of India. We'd go to Colombo, Sri Lanka, up the east coast of India, all the way to Bangladesh. And then we come back and do that again.
Wow.
And then we'd sail back from Karachi back to Durban, and from Durban north up to through the South Atlantic back to New York. It took 6 or 7 months.
What an incredible adventure. I mean, my goodness, and all that you were learning. I mean, to be able to visit all of these ports and get a flavor of the culture of all of these interesting many third world countries is just, it's tremendous.
Oh, Kristine, it was like being in Disneyland. I mean, you'd be on the ship, and had my own stateroom, and we eat in the officers' quarters. I mean, it was nice. I had somebody makes the bed all the time, and we get into these ports, and fortunately, the ships I was on were air conditioned. But once you stepped outside onto the deck to go, if you had time off and you go ashore. I mean, I was in Calcutta for 7 weeks one time straight. So I mean, I got to really know Calcutta pretty good.
Sure.
And the reason for that is because the dockage space was limited, and half the time you'd spend, we call it on the hook, on anchor, out in the harbor. And these water taxis would come out and take every couple of hours. They'd come out and pick up people that wanted to go ashore. You'd walk down they'd have the gangway swung out, and you could go aboard these water taxis. And when you're in port, it's not the same watch standing rotation where you work 4 hours on, 8 off. You'd work a full day, like 8 to 5, and then you might have 3 days off. Or you could finagle, you could trade watches with other guys. You could take a week off. You could actually, I could have actually taken off for a week, as long as I got back to the ship when I had to do, when my trade time was up and I had to be back. So, yeah, India was consuming, because I forgot what it was like to be here.
Well, Steve, if we bring this back to an art focus, I want to address an image that you sent to me that was done kind of on or around, or maybe even shortly after this time, but it ties in perfectly to what you're talking about. Talk to us about the red tanker.
All right, so I guess basically refocusing back into art. Of course, Nella came into I met Nella when I was in the Merchant Marine, when I went to the Mediterranean. So Nella became a center of my life. In fact, I had to leave the sea because of her. So, and I had to get a job as an engineer ashore, which I did. And we ended up going to Spain on a construction project. And that was early 70s. So before we left in 1976, during the bicentennial, as you recall, all the tall ships came to Boston.
Right.
So we went there, and we were overwhelmed with this, to the point where, and we had always used to go to Rockport and hang out up Bearskin Neck. And I remember going there one time with her around this time, before we went off to work, that I work in Spain. We had visited Eric Ronberg's modeling shop on Bearskin Neck. And this was back when Bearskin Neck was less, it was more, I think it was more artistic and less commercial than it is now.
Right.
So we walked in and saw the model ships and the bicentennial, tall ship thing. And I was actually enthralled by looking at his models. And I said, I'm going to try this. So I actually bought a couple of model kits, had them with me when we went to Spain. And we went off to Spain when we had our first child, Zach. And it was supposed to be a 6-month tour working with Westinghouse, and it ended up being 6.5 years.
Oh, goodness. So
we went there, and when I wasn't working, I was building model ships. And I kept doing it, and it became a love that I really enjoyed. And Nella was painting, and she was painting marine paintings. And I was looking at them, and she was doing it on commission. And I would always comment, this didn't look right at, and she was making all these adjustments, and she really wasn't enjoying doing this because of my critiques. So she said, why don't you do these? You can draw. Why don't you do your artwork, and let me do the marine art the way I want to do it? And I said, all right, I guess I'll draw that, because I could draw. So I guess I melded my drawing and my shipbuilding, model shipbuilding love into drawing boats and ships and yachts, and And I think we had come back from vacation one time, and we'd gone to the Addison Gallery here in Andover, and I had seen Winslow Homer's work.
Mm-hmm.
I fell in love with his work, and then I found another guy that I forget how I came upon, Arthur Briscoe, a British marine artist that did a lot of watercolors.
Mm-hmm.
Those two styles just floored me.
Mm-hmm.
So I decided to start painting in watercolor, and with no instructions other than what my mother had taught me years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, the first watercolors were, I mean, I still have them in a drawer, very static. And I did that for years.
Mm-hmm. You were brave.
Well, I mean, but I kept doing it. And finally,
Very determined.
I was getting to the point where the red tanker was finally done.
Mm-hmm.
And I had done that, and at a whim, I entered it into at the Marine Art Gallery at Mystic Seaport, when they were operational, they had an annual event called the International Maritime Art Exhibit, and artists from around the world could enter their work in there.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought the red tanker had come out well enough. It was still pretty static,
Mm-hmm.
but I submitted that. Well, it got in. Not only got in, it won the Museum Purchase Award. And I couldn't believe this. So that was kind of the validation that I needed, I suppose, at the time, because I had really been busting my butt to try to get to the point where I could feel good about my artwork.
Yeah.
That happened.
That was meant to be. That was meant to be. So talk to us also about Hard Pressed.
All right, well then, sticking with the marine theme, I mean, I was consumed. I was doing marine paintings, watercolor after watercolor. I mean, literally hundreds of these things. And the way Nell and I operate is we kind of watch a lot of YouTube, and we buy a lot of art books and magazines. Mm-hmm. I think there was an art magazine laying around Nell's in our house, and it was there was an article in there about the Austrian watercolorist Bernhard Vogel. And I saw his work, and it was like, wow, look at this work. Absolutely incredible image, and the way he used the colors. And I said, yeah, I've got to shift gears a little bit and see if I can introduce some of his freedom of water and color in my marine art. Well, then Hard Pressed came around, and I had done maybe 20 paintings in that vein, all large, full sheet of watercolor paper. So that means that they're 22 by 30. And basically all I was doing was I would start with a pretty tight pencil sketch, mm-hmm. and I soft lead pencil on the watercolor paper. And I didn't care about the lead smudging, because it had a little bit of character, I thought, to the finished product. I don't, as you probably know, I don't really like things that are clean and neat.
Yeah, I love that about your perspective. By the way, I love the fact that you really gravitate to the imperfection.
Yeah, I think it has a way of exposing some character, I think. In fact, I don't really like pretty things, mm-hmm. very tightly, like even the model ships that I did. I mean, there's two types of model shipbuilders. There's ones that do really tight and perfect, everything is exactly right. And then there's those like August Crabtree, mm-hmm. famous model shipbuilder, from the Norfolk, Virginia, that everything is beautiful, but then they'll throw some dust in there and some grime,
right,
and paint chips, and so it looks like an actual ship that was just shrunk down. And you look at the figures that he would carve in there; they look, I mean, they were incredible. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of my push in the art, my push in the model ships was that. So Hard Pressed was probably the start of many watercolors that I had done, where I started off with kind of a tight pencil drawing, mm-hmm. to be followed with very loose washes of water and color, excuse me, saturated color. I mean, even just throwing water on it and just splashing water everywhere, because the Bernhard Vogel style just kind of ran over me.
Hear more about the influence of Stuart Davis and the Ashcan group, and then how that perhaps led you into creating Mulligan.
Uh, Again, I think I was watching YouTube. There's a show on there that it's called The Calm Report. And this guy that drives around on his bicycle in New York City, visiting and critiquing art shows at galleries. And he does it with his cell phone.
No.
And they're pretty good. So there was one that he had done that I watched. It was, I forget the title of it, but it was at the Whitney. He was in there reviewing all the work. It was a retrospective of Stuart Davis's work.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know that Stuart Davis was a part-time Gloucester resident and had work at the Cape Ann Museum at the time. I didn't know this.
Mm-hmm.
But I watched the video and fell in love with Stu Davis and
Mm-hmm.
everything that he did.
Mm-hmm.
And bought a few books, read a lot, everything I could about him, realized that he was at the Cape Ann Art Museum, went up there to visit and saw some of his pencil sketches, just totally enthralled with him. And I said, I need to break away from marine art. I need to do something different. It's too pigeonholed.
Mm-hmm.
And I had been doing enough of it where I was just getting tired of it.
Mm-hmm.
I had enough of it shown around, enough of it sold, and I just wanted to do something different.
Mm-hmm.
So again, my love of music, and I love jazz and I love classical. I said, let me just try to, like Nella said, just be free with everything. And I had something kind of popped up after immersing myself with the Stuart Davis thing. And I had done a few, I'm going to say, I had what I call a jazz series that I had done. Is a number of oil paintings that were my impressions of, say, Jerry Mulligan was actually, it's sitting here behind me.
Yes, I'm looking at your piece thinking, yeah.
And I had another one for Miles Davis, another one for John Coltrane, one for Louis Armstrong. So, I do like to work in series, so I get these urges or these passions out of my system. And yes. I had done probably a half a dozen, 8 or so paintings like Mulligan, mm-hmm. based on my inspirations of Stu Davis. Mm-hmm. And so that's basically how that came about. But like I say, unlike watercolors, which you can start and finish in a couple of hours, the oils like Mulligan do take some time to compose, and the ability to use the colors in a real saturated manner was very pleasing for me. I just kind of like moving the colors around, but it is a lot more problematic than, say, watercolors, mm-hmm. because the solvents and the air conditioning that you need and all that. So
right. You have to think differently.
Yeah.
Before we move on, because you've just talked about how you like to create work in a series, and you've been so busy, really, for these last 7, 8, 9 months. I'd love to talk about a piece titled "The Artist." This piece just really captured my heart, I have to say.
So I guess somewhere around the Stu Davis time, I was introduced by someone to this artist who had passed away years ago. Name was Joan Erdsley, a Scottish artist. Mm-hmm. And I think there might have been a YouTube thing about her as well, but I ended up getting one of a book. It was like a pamphlet that had all of her work in it. Again, like Stu Davis, like Bernhard Vogel, her work was very free. Mm-hmm. And she depicted children, ghetto children from around in Scotland, mainly Edinburgh, and I can't figure out what town it was, but she in her own time, she became really well known, and her work was really unique, and I loved her work. Mm-hmm. Launched me into doing a lot of figurative work, and my subjects were our grandkids, our own kids, and maybe 20 or so paintings in oil and gouache and mixed media. Mm-hmm. So the artist came about. That's our granddaughter, one of our 7 grandkids. That's Alexandra, who was coming to paint with Nella at least once a week ever since she was 1. Oh. And that's her in front of the the easel in the studio, Nella's studio. Mm-hmm. And like I say, it was. I went through a phase, and I still like to bounce back to it every once in a while. I mean, at the time that I was kind of doing that, I also looked at a lot of Milton Avery's work. I love his work. And I tried experimenting with some oils and some gouaches that kind of in that vein.
Let's talk about the work that you've been doing really since the start of COVID. I mean, when you and I talked earlier, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I think you told me you've made as many as 60 pieces in this new series of work.
Oh, yeah.
And I've seen a number of pieces that have been shown at various galleries this summer and into the fall. I was totally wowed. Take it away. Talk to us about your assemblages.
Well, there's two things. First of all, there's the collages and then assemblages. So the assemblage is more of a three-dimensional collage, I guess. Basically, again, I got introduced to the German collage artist Kurt Schwitters, and later by another German, or maybe she was Austrian, Hannah-Laura Baron, who did a lot of collages, but did a lot of assemblages, stuff in old beat up wooden boxes. Well, I decided, let me try this. And the thing about collage work, let me start with collage, is that you end up looking for scraps of paper and whatnot on the streets even. And if I find something that is beat up and gnarly and has some color, maybe not color, but has some tone to it, I'll save it. So I have a lot of different thin boxes, like file boxes down in my work studio that have kind of one type of color or a text or whatnot. So I have a lot of this stuff handy. And we were kind of trapped in the house here starting in March because of COVID. And I said, well, instead of having to go out and buy canvases or watercolor paper or paints, I think I'm going to try collage and rip, tear, and size paper and glue it and roll it onto old recycled cardboard, mat board, watercolor paper. And a lot of it has to do with, it's just kind of a feeling. There's really no rhyme or reason to it, but the thing that's nice about collage is that you can find a large swath of color, stick it on there. But now you have to have some color sense or some design sense or some tonal sense to be able to figure out what goes on next. It's just kind of a gut feel. And when it's the same thing, you don't really know when it's done, but it's just a gut feel. It feels like it's done. And then what you do is if you put a mat over it, the mat kind of pulls it all together like a watercolor. When you finish the watercolor, when you drop a mat on it, it kind of like, whoa, it's a different piece of art than it. But during the collage rush of mine, in trying to explore things, I happened to find this artist, Hannah-Laura Baron, who was, she was during the Nazi, she lived during the Nazi regime in Germany. And I mean, she had a pretty hard time because she was Jewish. And a lot of her work I happened to see online, and it was like extremely nostalgic, extremely emotional. And I'm not sure what she went through. I'm sure she went through some hell there. I don't really know her backstory, but her work kind of speaks for itself. So Noel and I would go to, on Sundays during the spring and summer, we'd go up to the flea market in Raleigh every Sunday morning and look for stuff. And that's a good place to find ripped and old paper, good place to find old wooden boxes that are all beat up. And I found some old wooden boxes like the one you're referring to. Now you need to be able to put things inside of the box. And again, there's some tonality to it, not necessarily color, but there has to be some tonality to it. Grunge that has to be built into the pieces that you find. And there has to be some manner in which they go together that reflects my inner feeling to what I'm doing, and perhaps brings some outside story to how they go together. What does this mean? What are they trying to convey? And for me, it's a lot of real strong texture and tone. I mean, I think if you have that, it speaks to a lot of people, and maybe they don't know why. It just kind of works.
Mhm.
But the second engineer, I mean, I was a second engineer when I finished the Merchant Marine. That means, I had a specific function on board a ship, and a lot of the pieces that are in that assemblage are maybe mechanical contrivances or parts of mechanical pieces. I mean, there's some piano keys in there. There's some ivory, ivory part of the piano keys, the ebony. There's a gear in there. There's a screw, a lever. You get down in the engine room of a ship. There's all kinds of things going on down there. I mean, it's not a quiet place. It's noisy and sweaty, and the smell of oil, lube oil everywhere in the atmosphere. It's a noisy, hot place.
Very textured. I love it. Very textured. Well, yeah. Steve, let's talk about where you're headed next. What's on your mind now? What's your next adventure in your art practice?
I've had the urge to get back into oil painting, so I've actually prepped a canvas and a board, and on the canvas I've actually sketched in an underpainting. So I'm thinking getting back into oil painting, but nothing very tight. I kind of want to explore the freedom that I had in my figurative work. And so I've got this image on this canvas. I'm just waiting for the base coat. I call it a seal coat. Just put in a wash just to kind of seal the pencil sketch. And let's see what happens after that. I mean, I don't, for some reason, I don't have the urge to get back to watercolors. I don't know what it is. I like gouache, but I'm kind of not interested in watercolors for the moment, but oils.
Well, I think everything, comes when it comes.
Yeah, I mean, that you never know. I mean, with artists, we
don't know.
Really don't know what's coming up.
We don't know what's coming. That's part of the attraction, honestly. So, Steve, where can we find you? Give a shout out on your URL.
Well, I do have a website that I maintain rather regularly, not as much as Nala does, but it's stevenlush.com. If you go on the website and you Google gallery at For India, you will find my work there, mostly marine work. Catherine likes my marine work. She does have some of my, I think she has one or two of my jazz series pieces. But you have to kind of deal with what the gallery wants. Of
course, yeah. Yeah, it's a bit of a dance, especially when you're as diverse as you are.
Yeah, you have to keep them happy. And then Nell and I have a lot of work hung at our studio at Solo in Boston.
Right.
Because of the pandemic, we don't get in as much as we'd like to, but it's still there. And if somebody, we go pass by and the door's locked, there's a phone number, you can call us and we can go open it up. Or our home here in North Andover, and we have stuff all over the house here.
It's by appointment. And you're also on Instagram.
And I show regularly at Rockport Art and North Shore Art. I mean, we do all that.
Well, Steven Lush, I have to say it's been such a pleasure to talk to you. I've learned so much. You're just fascinating, honestly.
Well, thank you so much, Kristine. It's been my pleasure.
It's been such a treat. Everybody, we've been talking to Steven Lush. I'm Kristine Fisher, your host today. And for our listeners, I want to say you can access Steve's interview on 1623 Studios media platform, to include Channel 12 and YouTube. That's it for today. Look forward to next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristine.